Thank you all for coming this evening. It's my pleasure to welcome our speaker for the evening. I first read his book. It's called War is the Force That Gives Us Meaning several years ago, and I liked it so much I then went and bought his next book, Empire of Illusion, his next one, Death of a Liberal Class. But I've intentionally waited to buy this one till I bought it today from our bookstore because I wanted to hear what he had to say about it. However, there's been some news that's kind of disturbing today in Paris. And I thought we'd just take a moment to think about those that died in the terrorist attacks. So we'll just have a moment of silence. And actually, having Chris here is kind of timely. He spent a lot of time in the Middle East and Europe. So we were talking, I think he's going to reshape some of what he says tonight to talk about the issue that's in the news. I think it's a perspective that we won't hear very often in the United States. Chris Hedges did his BA at Colgate and his Master's of Divinity at Harvard. He writes a really good column for Truthdig. If you've never checked it out, I really highly recommend going there every Monday because it appears Monday morning. He teaches classes at maximum security prisons in New Jersey, works with all sorts of activist groups, and I've really learned a lot from reading the things he's written. So without any further ado, Chris Hedges.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I'm an Arabic speaker. After the events of 9/11, I was based in Paris, and I covered Al-Qaeda in Europe and the Middle East. And before I speak about the book, I think I just want to reflect a little bit about what we saw today, because it's not the last time we're going to see catastrophic terrorist events in Europe and potentially the United States. For those of you who haven't been following the story out of Paris, in a series of attacks, coordinated attacks, over 140 people have been killed, some by suicide attacks, some by people opening fire, I assume with automatic, probably AK-47s, including at a concert hall where over 100 people were killed. And I'm going to roll all the way back to 9/11. So when 9/11 happened, because I was an Arabic speaker and because I had been in the Middle East, the New York Times immediately sent me to cover Al-Qaeda globally, which meant that I speak not only Arabic but French and Spanish, so it meant that I pretty much covered Al-Qaeda everywhere in Europe except Germany. I don't speak German. And then everywhere Al-Qaeda was operating throughout the Middle East. I'm one of the very few reporters who has interviewed members of Al-Qaeda. Some of you may know that, or may not know, that I sued Barack Obama in federal court in 2012 over Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. This is a provision that permits the U.S. military, overturning over 150 years of domestic law, to essentially act as a police force on the streets of American cities, to seize U.S. citizens who substantially support, in the language of that section, that's not material support, that's not a legal term, substantially support Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or something called associated forces, another nebulous term, strip them of due process, which means they would never see a lawyer, never go to court, and hold them until, quote unquote, the end of hostilities, which is in an age of endless war, indefinite detention. And the reason that I sued him is because when I and the lawyers went back, and I'd spent 20 years as a foreign correspondent, we were able to draw up 17 groups on the U.S. State Department terrorism list with whom I had had direct contact, and in some cases had actually traveled, with the case of the PKK, which is the Kurdish separatist movement in Turkey, had actually traveled with armed members of that group. And because you're writing from that perspective, because you're giving voice to those elements, the argument of the lawyers was that I had much to fear from the passage of this law, because it can be easily interpreted that if you're doing an interview with a member of Al-Qaeda and publishing it in the New York Times, you can substantially support Al-Qaeda. We ran into this when I covered the war in El Salvador from 1983 to 1988. During the Reagan administration, because we were traveling with the FMLN rebels in El Salvador, traveling with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua in the Contra War, we were being constantly denounced by officials in the Reagan administration as being a fifth column. And we won in the Southern District Court in New York. The Obama administration appealed that decision, and it was overturned, not because they ruled on the merits, because it's patently unconstitutional within the American system to use the military as a police force, but they deny your standing. That's the classic way the courts have not effectively confronted wholesale surveillance and the evisceration of privacy. Another complete rejection of the Constitution, but also in this case. So these are groups that I know intimately, that I've spent tremendous time with, and I want to say that to understand is not to condone. No one can condone what happened in Paris. No one can condone what happened in 9/11. These are horrific crimes against humanity. But if we don't understand how those people got there, then we're never going to effectively be able to confront the specter of terrorism, what we've seen tonight in Paris, and what I think we are going to see again in the future. So after the attacks of 9/11, I was in the Middle East. And within the Muslim world, which is 1/5 of the world's population, most of whom are not Arab, there was utter revulsion at what had been done in the name of Islam, in the name of their religion. And one of the complaints by the Islamophobes in the United States and even in Europe is that Muslim leaders don't denounce acts of terrorism. This is just patently false. There were incredible denunciations of the attacks of 9/11 throughout the Muslim world, including at the time the highest Sunni Muslim cleric, the Sheikh of Al-Azhar in Cairo, denouncing these people as apostates, as not representative of Islam, and denouncing Osama bin Laden by name. And what I understood or grasped traveling throughout the Muslim world in the weeks after 9/11 was that we had garnered the empathy not only of the world, and some of you may not remember, but right after the attacks of 9/11, Le Monde ran a headline which read, "We're all Americans." This was a sentiment that we should have built upon. that the only way to fight terrorism is to isolate terrorists within their own societies. And the attacks of 9/11 had gone a very long way to doing that. Unfortunately, we fell into the very dark jingoism of nationalism. And nationalism, the flip side of nationalism is always racism. Because I was based in Paris, even coming back to the newsroom of the New York Times, I would hear, because the French opposed our calls to invade Iraq, arguing correctly, of course, that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. I would hear jokes about the French, racist jokes about the French. Nationalism is about a blind self-exaltation at the expense of the other. And we drank very deep from that dark elixir, and it blinded us. And so we went into Afghanistan, and we went into Iraq, and we began dropping iron fragmentation bombs all up and down the Middle East. And that's just what Al-Qaeda wanted. We became the most potent recruitment force for jihadists, radical jihadists, and we remain a potent recruitment force for jihadists. And what happened with the occupation of Iraq, which I think all of us who were Arabists understood, and it was fascinating at that moment, although to get up and speak this truth was a very difficult and often costly exercise. And I was booed off of a commencement stage in Rockford College for denouncing, everything's on YouTube, including this, where although I was speaking out of a tremendous body of experience, the crowd wasn't ready to hear it. It was, waving the flag. So they cut my microphone twice. I was jeered and booed. At one point, the crowd of 1,000, most everyone stood and began singing "God Bless America" to drown me out. And we proceeded to carry out what I would argue is perhaps the most catastrophic strategic decision in American history, and that was to attempt to invade and occupy Iraq, which has shattered Iraq as a unified country. It's never coming back. And by essentially going in and dismantling the civil society, dismantling Saddam Hussein's bureaucracy, dismantling Saddam Hussein's police, security forces, and armed forces, created the vacuum of a failed state that gives rise to radical movements. And the dispossession of the Iraqis, the inability on the part of the occupying forces to communicate in any language other than violence, meant that it was inevitable that the response to that occupation would be one of violence. Al-Qaeda was in fact never in any way an existential threat to the United States, nor was it a particularly dangerous terrorist threat, unlike ISIS, because it was a very different kind of organization. Al-Qaeda was a clan-based organization. That's one of the reasons it was so hard for foreign intelligence agencies to penetrate it. So by that I meant that if you came into the Al-Qaeda organization, you were somebody's second cousin from, the next hill over in Afghanistan or somewhere like that. There were familial ties, and ISIS, and I'll talk a little bit about how we got ISIS. ISIS, in many ways, and ISIS grows out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Zarqawi. And there were huge disputes about creating a sectarian war. Osama bin Laden actually did not want to create a sectarian war between Shiites and Sunnis in Iraq. The radical jihadists in Iraq, who eventually morphed into ISIS, believed that if they could create a sectarian war, that's why you had all the bombings of Shiite mosques, if they could create a sectarian conflict, then it would be possible to build a radical Sunni organization. But if Shiites and Sunnis actually came together, and Iraq was a very secular society before we destroyed it, then creating a radical Islamic state would be impossible. And so that sectarian strife orchestrated by the radicals in Iraq, which Osama bin Laden finally came around to supporting, was the mechanism that created the civil war that we essentially have been caught up in. And what happened was, with the start of the conflict in Syria, you had a figure named Baghdadi who took the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq, went into Syria. And what happened in Syria is very much what happened in Afghanistan in the war with the Soviets, where the Americans pumped in, and the Saudis and the Qataris and others, money, arms, tremendous amounts of resources, but there's no control. These are zones where there is no infrastructure, there is no structure. And so ISIS, which is an amalgam of these Iraqi and Syrian jihadists, managed to collect tremendous amounts of resources and weapons that were being provided in the attempt to overthrow the Assad regime. The same thing happened when the United States decided to back forces that were attempting to overthrow the Soviets in Afghanistan. And what we did is we funneled all of our money and resources through the Pakistani security agency called the ISI. And Pakistan lives in mortal fear of India. So the only sort of strategic decision that Pakistan cared about was making sure that a Kabul government would be hostile to Delhi. And that's why they starved groups that were secular and made sure that all of the weapons and support went to al-Qaeda. This is American money, American support, and the Taliban. And then Osama bin Laden brings it back. So in the same way that we fostered, through our inability to understand the dynamics on the ground, the creation of al-Qaeda, we've done the same with ISIS. And ISIS has now carved out an area the size of Texas. And that makes it radically different. They're different on many ways. Al-Qaeda was a nihilistic organization in the sense that it never sought to control territory in the Middle East. And this was part of the conflicts, as those of us who were covering it, this was part of the conflicts that Al-Qaeda had with jihadist groups like the Gama Islamiyya in Algeria. So you had a coup in 1991, an Algeria military coup, which overthrew an Islamic elected government, the FIS. And then there was a huge insurgency in Algeria. But they were always at odds with al-Qaeda, because al-Qaeda said the enemy is the United States. All resources have to go to attacking the United States or Europe. And the sort of nationalist jihadist groups wanted to take territory and create Islamic states. That's one of the things you'll often hear Hamas, the Palestinian group, attacked as a terrorist organization. What most people don't know is that al-Qaeda has long condemned Hamas as apostates, because through the Egyptians they negotiate with Israel to create ceasefire. So it's the same thing we saw with communism, that there are all sorts of strains, different antagonisms, different goals. I mean, this is how you get the difference between Tito's Yugoslavia, who stands up and defies Stalin, And if you can't see beyond the demonization of those radical movements at all, then you respond blindly, which is what we're doing. So what we saw with the rise of ISIS was something very new in the Middle East, not seen since 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel. And ISIS has used many of the tactics that the Palmat and the Jewish forces used to overthrow or remove the British from Palestine and create Israel. Foreign fighters, foreign money, terrorism, and massive ethnic cleansing. And finally, like ISIS, they hold out a vision. In the case of Israel, it's the recreation of the lands of the Bible, Judea and Samaria. In the case of ISIS, it's the 7th century caliphate that they're going to recreate. And this is how Baghdadi presents himself, and the Iraqi cleric, who, unlike Osama bin Laden, actually has theological training. He presents himself now as the caliphate. And by creating this huge area under their control that crossed borders between Syria and Iraq, they redrew the map of the Middle East. And one of the things that you'll always hear, many people in the Middle East speak about, and it was something that Osama bin Laden often spoke about, was the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement. And I always say, as somebody who covered the Middle East for many years, you can never understand the Middle East if you're only reading what I write in the New York Times. You have to read the history. You have to put things in context. You have to understand what happened with Sykes-Picot. You have to understand what happened in 1948 in Israel. You have to understand, what happened when the oil companies moved in, Aramco and others, into Saudi Arabia, or the attempt by Mossadegh in 1954 in Iran to nationalize the oil industries, seeing the United States orchestrate the coup of, arguably the only democratic government ever in place in the Middle East. And Sykes-Picot was the agreement between the French and the British to carve up the Middle East after World War I, into regions of control. Iraq, was essentially created. These were out of the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. So that map that was drawn by imperialists in Europe and cut, clans in half, tribes in half. I mean, it had made no sense given the demographics of the region, has never changed until 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel. And then the next change was now with ISIS. And if you see pictures of ISIS, you will see along the Syrian-Iraq border that they'll actually put up signs with Sykes-Picot and put X's through it, that the colonial imposition of a map is being eradicated. The rise of ISIS coincides with something else that's deeply troubling, and that is the dispossession in the age of neoliberalism, not only of many people in the United States, and half of this country, of course, we just had the recent federal statistics released, 51% of Americans earn under $30,000 a year for a household of four. Officially, the poverty rate is 24,000 something, a little less than 25,000, which I think most economists recognize as a ridiculous bar. And so we have half of this country living in poverty. And then if we add a category called near poverty, we're pushing, upwards 60, 70%. This is happening globally. Neoliberalism is a global phenomenon. And what it targets first are, of course, the vulnerable, the workers, unskilled labor, I don't know if you've been following the TPP negotiations, but as with all of these trade agreements, this steadily impoverishes the working class in industrialized countries, in essence forcing them to be competitive in the global marketplace, which means being competitive with prison labor in China or sweatshop workers in Bangladesh who make 22 cents an hour. And this has affected people in the developing world, and it has affected immigrants, and in particular Muslim immigrants in countries like France, which has about 5 million North African immigrants. And just as much of America is a segregated society, I live in New Jersey, I live in Princeton. New Jersey is one of the most segregated states in the United States. Princeton is where the 1% lives, and you can drive 50 minutes to Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the country, and where 97 or 98% of the residents are people of color. I teach in the prison system in New Jersey, and African Americans make up 80 and upwards percent of all of my students. So in France is also a segregated society where people are trapped in what Malcolm X once called these internal colonies. And there they keep them on the outskirts of cities in what they call banlieues, which are these gigantic, Stalinist-looking housing projects. I wrote a story once out of something called the Cité de 4000, the city of 4,000, where unemployment rates for Arab youth run 50 or 60%. The police oppression that is common to people of color in our own internal colonies is endemic within France. I was once on the metro, the Paris metro at night, and saw police pull a North African immigrant out of a car. As far as I could tell, there was no questioning, and start beating him on the platform as the train pulled away. And what's happened with these immigrants is some of them may have spent 3 or 4 years in Algeria or Tunisia where they were born, or they may have been first generation, and they, in essence, are raised in France. They speak French, but they're not considered by the French to be French. Yet when they go back to Algeria or Tunisia or Morocco, they're not considered to be from the countries of origin. And they suffer this terrible identity crisis where they don't seem to belong anywhere. They don't have the capacity to find meaningful work, to find a sense of place, and these become very susceptible to the embrace of radical jihadist movements, and we see it within the United States as well. With many members of the Christian right, we see the same kind of hatred for secular society. I spent 2 years writing a book on the Christian right called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War on America. And I come out of the liberal church, so I think I carried certain prejudices when I went into that book, prejudices that were eradicated actually in the 2 years that I spent, because when I would gather with people who were involved in these movements, these mega churches, Right to Life, all of these, I found how the suffering that they had endured was very, very real. I once went to a pro-life weekend in Valley Forge, and it was obviously about abortion, and they asked all the post-abortive sisters to stand, and a room of about 400 women stood, almost all of them. And then when I started doing the interviews, I found that it wasn't that they'd had an abortion, most of them had had multiple abortions. And the movement played on their sense of shame and their guilt so that they were taking them to retreats, weekend retreats, and they were giving these women dolls, and they were telling these women that these were the children that they murdered, and that they had to name the doll, and bathe the doll, and dress the doll, and then at the end of the weekend they had a ceremony where they had to hold up, in essence, the child that they were told they had murdered, beg for forgiveness from God, and promise to fight the culture of death, which is us. And it was from writing that book and having interview after interview with people who had suffered horrific struggles with substance abuse, domestic violence, sexual molestation, bankruptcy, that I grasped how one moves into a non-reality based belief system, which is what all radical ideologies are about. It is about a Manichaean view of the world of black and white, right and wrong, saved and infidel. And that's very much a part of what's happening within these jihadist movements, driven by the same level of despair, driven by the same closing of any avenues of hope, including the possibility of work. And we're seeing that manifest itself in various forms throughout the neoliberal order, including the United States. We're hardly immune from that. ISIS, however, is a far more dangerous organization than Al-Qaeda, because, as I said, Al-Qaeda was clan-based. Whatever revenge they wanted to take, it was extremely difficult for them to even get not only people into the United States, but even people into Europe. One of my jobs when I first started covering Al-Qaeda was to recreate, as far as possible, everything that Mohammed Atta, who was the mastermind behind 9/11, had done in the weeks and months before the attack. And one of the last things he did in August, before the September 11th attacks, was make a trip to Spain. And it became clear that that trip was made because what Al-Qaeda would do, which had given him roughly $150,000, $200,000 to carry out the attacks, they would send couriers to Morocco and come over from Morocco, because there's a lot of passage back and forth between Morocco and Spain. They're physically very close by ferry, and bring him a bag full of money. And I was in one of the pensions where we believe he got the money, and his signature was still in the book. And I think most of us who covered Al-Qaeda came to believe that it would not have happened if Atta hadn't existed. He was brilliant. It's not something we ever wrote, but I think that from studying his, or looking at what he had said and wrote, I think he was gay. He had a deep hatred of women, especially Western women. I think, that conflict about his own sexuality. And people forget that, in the last 24 hours, a lot of those hijackers tried to get out of it. And it was Mohammed Atta who kept everyone's feet to the fire. ISIS has 30 to 40,000 foreign fighters, including 4,000 to 5,000 with European passports. And our response to the creation of ISIS, like our response to the creation of Al-Qaeda, has been to try and destroy them through violence. If you remember, a few months ago, ISIS captured a Jordanian pilot and put the pilot in a cage and burned the pilot alive in the cage. In the same way that when they behead prisoners, they dressed them in the orange jumpsuits from Guantanamo. Day after day, ISIS is watching our warplanes burn whole families alive, incinerate entire houses. And so what they did when they filmed the burning of the Jordanian pilot was carry out in a much cruder form exactly what they're experiencing. The longer that we use violence to crush a movement which has essentially risen up out of the dispossessed, the more we will create the kinds of incidents that we've seen tonight in Paris. And we're not going to be immune from those incidents. It's harder. The estimates are there's about 175 American passport holders with ISIS. It's not a surprise that it's France, given that there are easily, at this point, hundreds of ISIS fighters who carry French passports. But the longer that we continue to speak exclusively in the language of violence, the more those forces are going to respond in the language of violence. It's cruder, of course. But given what our drones are doing, given what our missiles are doing, it is inevitable that there will be, as they say, blowback. And I think for those of us who come out of the Middle East, this is something that happened tonight that we've long expected. And my fear, and I read Francois Hollande's response, and it caters to the worst kind of Islamophobia, the kind of painting of all Muslims as barbarians. It feeds that kind of darkness of nationalism, which I came as a war correspondent to believe was a disease. And it, in essence, propels us down this dark hole, which we've already, created throughout the region. I covered the Oslo peace agreement. I knew Yitzhak Rabin, and I knew King Hussein. And that, for those of us who are covering the Middle East, was kind of the last moment of hope. And Rabin did something remarkable, and something I would say I've only seen him do as a leader, and that was take a very unpopular stance within his own country, which was establishing a peace accord and Palestinian state, because Rabin understood that the occupation was killing Israel itself. And anybody who looks at the racism inherent in the Netanyahu regime will understand exactly Rabin's fear. And then I watched Rabin reach out and pull the rest of the country with him. It was really quite heroic. But Rabin understood that if you want to break the back of terrorism, it would only be done economically. That the Palestinians had to have a stake within Israel, which in very prosaic terms meant that Ahmed, who lived in Gaza City, would have a job in a garage in Tel Aviv and be able to come back and buy his family a refrigerator and send his kids to school. It's that basic. When you shut off all of those avenues of hope, then you create the specter of what the state calls terroristic violence. And we've seen within America the rise of nihilistic violence, 47 or 48 school shootings. 3 people a day are killed by police forces, most people of color. The system of mass incarceration, which is an attempt to control primarily black and brown bodies. all of the mechanisms, the harsh mechanisms of control, whether it is the evisceration of our own civil liberties and the rise of militarized police and the rise of mass incarceration and wholesale surveillance, or whether it is the endless wars in the Middle East, mean that when the state can speak exclusively in violence, the response will always be violent. We've had 26 or 27 law enforcement officials in the United States assassinated this year. That's not a gun battle. That's people sitting in a car, filling up their patrol car with gas and being shot through the head. These are all symptoms of decay to which we are not immune. And what we see in Paris tonight is emblematic of that decay, that commodification of the world, where neoliberalism tells us that human beings have no value, no intrinsic value. Pope John Paul II wrote, and I encourage you to read it, a very fine encyclical about work. And Pope John Paul II said, work is not about a wage, finally. It's about dignity. It's about a sense of worth within the society. It's about creating community. It's about creating empowerment. And as the neoliberal order sucks all of this away, then and uses the harsh forms of control that we're already seeing on the streets of American cities to maintain their dominance, then you're going to begin to see in variant forms the kinds of things that we're seeing in Paris. That all of those forces that have essentially excluded Muslims are the same forces that are excluding American workers or excluding African Americans who live in these impoverished, segregated communities that they can't get out of. It's the breakdown of civil society on a global and a national level. And I find it frightening. I've covered disintegrating societies in places like Yugoslavia. I know what it looks like. And unless we wrest back control, unless we overthrow the corporate state, unless we stop trying to build our society to maximize profit for corporations, which, by the way, have no loyalty to America. They've taken our jobs overseas. Most of them stash all of their money overseas. I think it's $17 trillion or something in wealth that they keep in offshore bank accounts. They're passing trade agreement after trade agreement so that, the most basic services by which the common good is maintained are taken from us, including things like the post office. And in Britain, if you want to know what a privatized post office looks like, read about what they've done to the postal service in Britain. It's a disaster. Because if it's about maximization of profit, then if you're in a rural community, you're just not going to get mail. And they don't want to deliver to houses because it's expensive, so there are boxes on the ends of streets. And of course, they don't deliver on the weekends. And once you have that kind of a monopoly, that's what it's about gaining monopolies. The privatization of education, it's all part of the same kind of fabric. And corporations know only one word, which is more. And they will not respond, as Frederick Douglass reminded us, until we respond. And that's what essentially this book, Wages of Rebellion, is about. It's about the moral imperative of revolt. And we haven't even spoken about climate change. It's about understanding that the system's been gamed against us, that all of the branches of government have been seized by corporate power, that it doesn't matter who's in the White House because the military-industrial complex Wall Street and the security and surveillance state is beyond control by any party. Parties are largely subservient to it, are completely subservient to it. And so we have to begin to get out and resist in the only way that we have left, which is through acts of sustained, nonviolent, civil disobedience, which is why I was very involved in the Occupy movement. And you, I'm sure, if we sent around a sheet of paper, the numbers of student loans that I could collect in this room alone would be horrifying. You should not be paying for your education. You should not have to pay for health care. People should not be pushed from their homes and mortgages and foreclosures because they were defrauded by banks. I mean, we live in a system where those who commit the crimes are bailed out and compensated, and the victims are left bereft. We should institute a massive jobs program, especially targeted at people under the age of 25, as they did during the New Deal. These are all rational responses, and of course, a switch to renewable energies. But the corporate state can't respond rationally. Power has been seized by a tiny cabal of global corporate oligarchs who are going to squeeze every last drop of blood they can from us. And we have no mechanisms left by which we can protect ourselves. The bailouts in 2008, constituent calls in Congress were 100-1 against those bailouts across the political spectrum, but they passed anyway. Nobody wants wholesale surveillance. Nobody wants to have their privacy taken away from them. Nobody wants all of their personal information, including their medical records and everything else, stored in perpetuity by corporations and the government. No one wants it, or very few people want it. And yet, we're powerless. It doesn't matter what we want. When we did the lawsuit in the NDAA, it was a 2-year legal battle, they did a national poll that found that that section of the NDAA had a 97% disapproval rating, and yet it passes anyway. Nobody wants the TPP, or very few people want the TPP, which is why they kept it in secret, so we couldn't see what they were doing to us. And that's a harsh reality to confront. But if we don't rise up to regain our civil society, if we don't once again orient our society not to maximize profit, but to foster the common good, then what we are going to see is various forms of disintegration, rising acts of violence. Rabin got it. In the same way that I believe that arguing, and I am a seminary graduate, arguing with members of the Christian right about creationism is futile. You know, that the only way to break the back of these radical movements is to reincorporate people into the economy and give them a place. That the answer is economic, and of course the dislocation that we're carrying out is becoming worse and worse. I went to Detroit to attend a End Times weekend with Tim LaHaye, who wrote the End Times series, Detroit being probably a pretty good setting. And I mean, it's always fascinating as a reporter. It's why I like reporting, because I learn, and a lot of the assumptions that I carry into something are shattered when I face the reality, including my deep empathy for many of the followers of the Christian right, my deep loathing for the charlatans who make tremendous money off of these people. And let's not forget that all these people, Pat Robertson is worth anywhere between 500 million and $1 billion. I mean, they're really preying on the vulnerable. But one of the things that struck me was how there were these graphic descriptions of the end times and people's eyes popping out and all this kind of stuff, none of which is biblical. But the excitement in the crowd, and I understood when I was there that excitement was essentially driven by the fact that the world outside of their kind of magic realism had almost destroyed them. And they weren't wrong. It had almost destroyed them. And the excitement that they had with those apocalyptic visions of the destruction of the world is that those negative forces that once brought them so low or nearly destroyed their life would not exist anymore. And you find exactly the same kind of apocalyptic vision within radical Islam itself. That it is about eradicating a world, in their eyes, a secular or a Christianized world that almost destroyed them. Very similar kind of ethic, or if you want to, ethic perhaps isn't the right word, but very similar kind of worldview. And I think all of this comes from the social, political, and economic disintegration which we are living under, which is happening globally, and which those of us who care about restoring a world of some kind of sanity have to rise up and resist. And by resist, I mean sustained acts of civil disobedience, whether that's against fracking, whether that's against police violence, whether that's the fight for fast food workers and a $15 minimum wage, whether it is that battle against student debt, which is throwing so many of you as you graduate into crippling forms of debt peonage. That's what drove the Occupy movement. It was largely the sons and daughters of the middle class who had burdened themselves with tens of thousands of dollars in debt and then got out and found out there was no place for them. They began to experience what poor people of color have been experiencing now for a long time, including police violence. And finally, to close, it's climate change itself. Even if we stop all carbon emissions today, we're still going to suffer catastrophic effects of climate change. And yet we are unable to halt the attacks by the fossil fuel industry across the planet, including the fracking industry, which is destroying our water. And when courageous communities like Denton, Texas rise up, the superstructure of the state, in this case the Texas Senate, says you don't have a right to control your own destiny. We are banning the ban. And this has been going on in Colorado, Ohio, Pennsylvania, everywhere there is fracking. Communities organized, communities asked to protect themselves and their children from the effects of fracking, and the courts or the state legislature says you don't have a right. And what that is creating is a radicalization that, as Ralph Nader points out, runs across the political spectrum. It is a window into how we've lost the ability, we don't count. So I think that what happened in Paris is not disconnected from what's happening to us, what's happening here, and that on the one hand, while we have to mourn for the victims and, of course, condemn what took place, we also have to begin to address those causes that create this kind of phenomena if we're ever going to defeat it. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have a little bit of time. We'll take about 20 minutes for questions. Please don't use the questioning to make a speech. Instead, ask a short question, and we can have Chris answer it. Then we have some books that I'm sure Chris will be happy to sign if you'd like to get one over there. But I will warn you they're doing some sort of test at 9 o'clock. So we're gonna wanna get out of here around 9 o'clock. So Clayton's got a microphone. If you would like to ask a question, just raise your hand and he'll run over there. There's the first one, way over there, Clayton.
In your talk about how to respond to terrorist attack and the problems that are going on within society, if you feel like we should respond the way that we currently are doing, what way do you feel like would be more appropriate to go about it? Because if we don't respond in the ways that we are doing, it would seem like we're being a bit of a pushover, but if we respond in ways of violence, and we are being too aggressive and having violent reactions. So I'm just curious in your opinion on how we should.
Well, it's the old story of, violence engendering violence. Is this working? Yeah, it's the old story of violence engendering violence. I mean, look at where violence in the Middle East has got us. What happens when, and I speak as somebody who spent most of my life covering conflicts and wars, is that when you open that Pandora's box of violence, you don't control it. So we went into Iraq to ostensibly implant democracy in Baghdad and watch it spread throughout the Middle East. We told the American public, well, Bush and Cheney and Wolfowitz and Pearl, that the oil revenues would pay for the reconstruction. We believed we would be greeted as liberators. All of this was a non-reality. Only people who had never spent any time in Iraq could believe such absurdities. And then when things didn't go according to our vision, we began to employ horrific acts of violence. Over 1.2 million dead in Iraq. Several million displaced and refugees. And the longer we used violence, the more we lost control. So today, we have empowered Iran. Baghdad is run as an Iranian puppet. We are bombing the forces that are fighting Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, who we vowed to overthrow, and whose forces are joined by Hezbollah, a group we declare to be a terrorist organization. We are acting as Hezbollah's air force. Well, all of the violence, it's like out of 1984. Yesterday's enemy has become today's ally. And it's that kind of notion of being a pushover or being... This plays to a very crude form of hypermasculinity of which nationalism caters to, but which is dangerous. I mean, I watched the build-up to the Iraq War, and there was one interview with one retired colonel after another about the power of our weaponry, what a cruise missile does, what a Tomahawk missile does, what a Hellfire missile does. And by, of course, extension, our own power. Well, we found out later that all of these retired colonels were working for defense contractors trying to sell the missiles. War is a business. But we never, having been a war correspondent, I know that what happens on the receiving ends of those missiles. And we don't see it. And we have to begin to respond with an astuteness that allows us to escape that hyper-masculine, militarized vision and rhetoric, which has gotten us into such tremendous trouble in the first place. The United States, with maybe the exception of Grenada, if you want to count that a war, has lost every war. We've been in almost endless war since Vietnam, and we've lost most of them. You could argue maybe not the first Iraq Gulf War, in which I entered Kuwait with the Marine Corps, but certainly the wars in the Middle East we've lost. We've destroyed Iraq. The Taliban controls more of Afghanistan now than it did when we went in. Brute force on the part of empire, and we can go back throughout history, finally defeats itself. And we're no exception to that. And we have squandered trillions of dollars, upwards by estimates $1.6, $1.7 trillion a year, on futile, useless wars when we should be responding to climate change. And if anyone's around in a few decades to write about our moment in history, they'll ask, what were they doing? They were facing a mortal threat. And they squandered all of their scientific, technological, and economic resources for nothing. And that's how the Roman Empire went down. That's how the British Empire went down with World War I, which was just collective suicide on the part of Germany, France, and Great Britain. I mean, it's not a matter of violence doesn't. I mean, I think if there's any evidence, we don't need any more evidence in the Middle East that violence doesn't work. And if we keep doing this, then what we saw in Paris is going to happen again and again and again and again. And that's just not. It's going to be a very frightening world to live in.
Is Pat Robertson involved with the global banks, and what is Pat Robertson's true vision that he really that's behind all this money?
Well, we know that he has some very questionable relationships with the diamond trade in Africa, and these people. It's just a business. It's about sucking money out of poor people for their own enrichment, promising them that this seed money will make them wealthy or cure their cancer. My frustration with the liberal church is that we didn't denounce them for who they are, which is Christian heretics. Jesus did not come to make us rich, and you don't have to spend 3 years of Harvard Divinity School as I did to figure that out. And we didn't call them out for who they are. They're not Christians. They've infused the worst aspects of capitalism and imperialism into the Christian religion, which is a species of fascism.
Yes, Mr. Hedges. Okay, so my question is, it pertains to violence, but what you previously talked about. And in the past, you have differentiated between violent protests and peaceful protests, and you've stated that you don't believe that the security and surveillance state can be challenged through violent means. So my question to you is, in another context, you've told the story about Nixon and Kissinger, and you've stated that in this, Nixon had ordered the White House to be barricaded by buses, and Nixon equipped to Kissinger, they're going to get through the barricades and they're going to come get us. And you use this to express what type of fear our leaders should feel. How do we, through nonviolent protests, achieve that when we have the liberal media and even leftists like yourself that say the Black Bloc is a cancer and groups like the Black Panther Party are parasites? Thank you.
Okay, well, I didn't say quite that the Black Party Panther were parasites. I can't remember that sentence, but that was, I think, that's certainly not my position. I did go after the Black Bloc. Karl Polanyi in The Open Society and Its Enemies writes that the question is not how do you get good people to rule. That, he writes, is the wrong question. Most people attracted to power, Polanyi writes, are at best, are pauper writes, are at best mediocre or venal. The question is how to make those in powerful frightened of you. So Howard Zinn, in The People's History of the United States, lays out that America was established as a closed system. The founding fathers, aristocratic white male slave owners, did not want a direct democracy. That's how we got the Electoral College, with Al Gore winning 500,000 more popular votes than George W. Bush, and George W. Bush being appointed by the Supreme Court with no legal precedent, our president. Nixon was our last liberal president because he was frightened of movements. These weren't violent movements. These were anti-war movements, environmental movements, Earth Day. And my problem with the Black Bloc, and you refer it, so I'm sure you're aware, is that the Occupy movement was in essence a mainstream movement. And you saw that on the weekends in Zuccotti Park when mothers would come with their strollers or fathers with their strollers, and and that's what terrified the state. And the Black Bloc essentially grafted itself onto that movement. And I would argue that the Black Bloc destroyed the movement in Oakland, because the African American leadership in Oakland, which has been fighting economic and racial injustice, you could argue more valiantly and harder than any other constituency in the United States. When I marched in Oakland, they demanded the Black Bloc leave, that they not even be part of the movement. The Black Bloc was going down and breaking windows and doing the kind of responses that they do. Most of them are kids. They can run, and they leave behind people with children, and they leave behind the elderly, and they leave behind the disabled. They leave behind undocumented workers who pay the price. And I think that, as Ishmael Reed, one of the great writers and leaders in Oakland, said, if they want to break windows, why don't they go up the road to La Jolla and break Romney's windows? Nobody in Oakland's going to mind. Why are they breaking windows in poor neighborhoods? The other problem is just quite strategic, in a sense that the state always seeks to demonize resistance movements, and the Black Bloc fed into that. So you saw in Baltimore, 4 days of peaceful protests. They had one minor incident with a drugstore. That's all people ever saw. That's what the state seeks to do. The other problem is we're heavily infiltrated, and the Black Bloc, because they cover faces, is an easy route for the police to enter. A lot of the terrorism cases, like in Cleveland and other places that we've seen, both with Muslims and radicals in the Black Bloc, is that they're completely set up by agents provocateurs. And this was also how they went after the Panthers. The Panthers were different. The Panthers were responding to out-of-control police violence. And the Panthers morphed and had all sorts of changes. By the end, they were primarily a social organization. Fred Hampton, the reason he was assassinated is because he was reaching out to all sorts of other groups, including dispossessed white groups. And so yes, we have to create fear. But if we attempt to respond to the security and surveillance state with violence, it's just, on practical terms, not a battle we're going to win.
How do you create fear?
You create fear the way the anti-war movement created fear. You create fear by creating enough of a mass in the same way that the ANC created fear to the apartheid regime, non-compliance. You create fear the way they did in the 1930s with massive sit-down strikes. There are lots of ways to make the system stop working without using violence. And we have to, if we don't get that critical mass, we're never going to be able to break the system down. If it remains a kind of fringe group, then the state can respond. The state doesn't worry about fringe groups. The state worries about mass movements. I covered the demonstrations in Eastern Europe, including the overthrow of the Stasi state in East Germany. And when you had 500,000 East Germans pouring into Alexanderplatz, chanting for the fall of, and then what happens is they sent out the state security, they sent elite paratroopers to Leipzig to shoot on the demonstrators, and they refused. Honecker was out. You appeal to the conscience of some of those within the systems of power to create paralysis within those systems. So when I was arrested in front of the White House with 133 veterans protesting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it turns out that a lot of the police were in the National Guard, and they were cuffing us and then whispering, "Keep protesting." Now that's what breaks the state. And just to talk, as somebody who's covered insurgencies, if you want to talk about violence, violence is an effective form in overthrowing a colonial power. Vietnam, Algeria, yes. But revolutions will only succeed, and Crane Brinton and Jeffrey Davies, the great theorists on revolution, have written at this, will only succeed when significant sections of the internal security apparatus defect. And that is carried out by essentially appealing to those through acts of conscience. Revolutions are different from colonial uprisings. And most revolutions ultimately are nonviolent. So in the Russian Revolution, they send the Cossacks into St. Petersburg to attack the bread rioters, the bread riots, and they refuse to fire on the crowd. They fraternize with the crowd. The Tsar is out within a week. He doesn't even make it back to St. Petersburg. He abdicates on a railway siding. That was true in Iran. Once the military no longer wanted to defend the discredited regime of the Shah, that's how revolutions work. And just finally, in the practical effects of an insurgency, and I've covered insurgencies like the war in El Salvador, no insurgency can be successful unless it has a neighboring state that is willing to allow it to carry out a staging area and ship it arms. And I think as somebody who's covered wars and has seen, we have 60,000 members of the Special Forces. These people are death squads, in essence. And I know what the state is capable of. And it's just not a game we're going to be able to beat them at. So there are practical and moral reasons why I remain firmly nonviolent. And I think partly because once you employ violence, as I said before, you never know where that violence is going to go. Does that answer your question?
No.
Okay.
My question, hopefully in the end, either get some general or specific advice for perhaps young people or young educators such as myself. For young people that are facing the end of would be higher education reform of all the student loans they have to pay.
Right.
And at the high school level of feeling that themselves and their students are subjected to endless state testing, or if you're a student of color, you face it even worse because you're at the borderline of not passing the test. What advice would you give to a critical educator or a young person that's entering that field or going in that direction? Where should they go? What perhaps should be the path that they should best take?
Well, the thing about getting into a college setting is that you have what you don't have once you leave college. You have physical space by which you can gather to organize. And once you leave, colleges, like all institutions, oftentimes do a very good job of selling you the story. It's worth it, take out the loans, it's your career. I've been to journalism schools, and I see these journalism students taking out tremendous loans, and I say to the professors, there's no jobs for these people. And they'll say something about the internet, and it's just not fair to the students. But the institutions have a vested interest in selling you on that idea for their own viability. So that by the time you get out and you owe $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 in loans, and you can't find a job, or you can't find a job that pays much above minimum wage, you've lost that community by which you can organize. And the largest personal debt in the country is student debt. And what's the Congress done? It's insane. They have created a mechanism by which, number one, you can never declare bankruptcy, ever. You can declare bankruptcy, but your student loans are just going to accrue interest. And in 3 years, you're going to start paying more interest rates than if you borrowed it from a bank. The cruelty of it is staggering. And I think that people have to organize on campus around the issue of student debt. And I've said at other schools, and you can find them, especially by graduate school, find 10 people who owe $100,000. That's $1 million. Those 10 people should go chain themselves to the president's office. This is just obscene what's being done to our students. So I think understanding the reality that's out there and using the space and the community that you have while you're in school to build resistance. And we've seen it. We saw it. We're seeing it on campuses around issues of racism. But I think you've got to organize, because none of these politicians are going to help you.
Okay, we're gonna take 3 questions and then cut off the questioning. So,
Okay, so my question relates to North Korea and specifically on his part on with the role of revolution. What can the international community do to influence the North Korean regime, the North Korean people, so as to create that and hopefully get rid of the labor camps that are extreme acts of inhumane cruelty?
I don't know that we have a lot of ability to pressure North Korea. I mean, it's one of those kind of rogue states that we've already applied pressure to in the forms of sanctions. Yeah, I mean, I covered Libya, I covered Libya under Gaddafi. I mean, there are states that are kind of impervious to pressure. So yeah, I don't have an easy answer on that. It's also not an area of the world I've covered, so I'm not terribly well versed in that.
You talk about.
I think they want the microphone. Why don't you say the mic?
Okay, I can talk loud enough so
Right, but they're recording it, so I think they.
You talk about violence begetting violence, and we are, years, decades, right in the middle of all this violence in the Middle East. How would you recommend that we, or as an informed citizen, how would you recommend that we inform our leaders to extricate ourselves from all this violence, and how long do you think it'll take?
Well, the problem is that you have the arms industry that's making a killing off of these wars. So we dropped, I think, 161 Tomahawk cruise missiles on Libya. Each missile costs $1.1 roughly $1 million. I mean, that's $500 million in a couple of days. And it gets to much more systemic issues. I mean, people should not profit off of war. So there's a huge incentive on the part of Raytheon and General Dynamics to keep these wars going, even though they have no popular support, and they've proved disastrous. I mean, we used to, the liberals and the Democratic Party used to be able to defy particular weapon systems. Now, you never hear anybody, even Bernie Sanders, decry one weapon system. They built the F-22 Raptors, and the Pentagon said we don't even want them. But it didn't matter, the contractors wanted them. So we've created this kind of Leviathan, this military-industrial complex that's hollowing the country out from the inside. I mean, officially we spend about 54% of discretionary spending on the military, but that doesn't count Veterans Affairs, it doesn't count the nuclear weapons program, it doesn't count the huge black budgets we're not allowed to see, including an estimated $100 billion a year for surveillance and intelligence. So, we've got to break the back of corporate power because they're the ones who essentially control the narrative. And the politicians dance to the tune they play, or they don't hold office.
I think a lot of the problem is that people are still laboring under the illusion that we live in a democracy, which we do not. We live in a fascist system where the corporations are in bed with the government. That's pure, plain, and simple enough for everybody but a cretin to see. I've heard you tell anybody to take their money out of big banks. I haven't heard anything about general strikes. I haven't heard anything about stop paying your taxes. General Alexander Haig said, let them protest all they want so long as they continue to pay their taxes.
Right.
So, to me, that's the only way that I can think of non-violently to get the message to the top 1%, that we're tired of your crap. And, here we are, not even on Thanksgiving yet, and before even Halloween, they're putting up Christmas trees and whatnot. It's consumerism writ large. And so long as people continue to consume and, buy things on credit, that's gonna keep the corporations propped up. So, and if you think that the top 1% are gonna go quietly into that good night, you got another thing coming, because they're not. We've allowed psychopaths and sociopaths to rise to the top of the food chain. So, you're talking about nonviolent revolution and withdrawing your consent. Wouldn't you agree that people taking their money out of big banks and putting them in credit unions, going on strike from work, blocking airports, blocking the streets, blocking the roadways, not allowing anything to get done, and then stop paying your freaking taxes? Wouldn't you agree that all of that would work?
Yeah, and that's very much the theme of this book, that sustained acts of civil disobedience to make the system, to disrupt and make the system inoperable is the only mechanism we have left. Yeah. I kind of focused tonight because of what happened in Paris on Paris. Obviously, it's an area of the world. There aren't a lot of Arabists walking around and know that area of the world well. But yeah, I think that it has to be sustained and radical and militant, and protests, for instance, against fracking cannot be held for the symbolism, but have to be almost militaristic in the sense that you just have enough people day in and day out to constantly get arrests to make construction impossible. I think that's all we have left, yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.